The galaxy was silent, too silent. Across distant planets there were no signs of life, no whispers of communication. That was until the Zalith arrived. The Zalith were a species thought to be nothing more than a legend, a story passed down through the ages. For centuries no one had heard a word from them, and their existence had become a forgotten myth. But now the galaxy was about to learn the truth. The Zalith had returned, and they were angry. It began in the outskirts of the galaxy at a location where few ships dared to travel. A lone ship, seemingly insignificant, appeared on the radar of a small human exploration vessel. The crew aboard the Tempest had no idea what was coming. They were investigating a newly discovered planet, hoping to gather resources. It was meant to be a simple mission, one that could keep them in the good graces of the Earth government. But that plan quickly fell apart. The first sign that something was wrong came when their communication systems failed. At first, the crew thought it was a simple malfunction. They tried to reboot the system, but no response came. They were completely cut off from the rest of the galaxy. Then the first signal came. A flash of red light lit up the sky outside the ship's windows. The Tempest shuddered as something massive passed by. Something they could not see but could feel. The ship's sensors detected a force stronger than anything they had ever experienced. A gravitational pull that seemed unnatural. The crew scrambled to understand what was happening. What the hell was that? Lieutenant Emma Phillips, the ship's navigator, asked. Her voice was tense, filled with uncertainty. She turned to her captain, Commander Jake Matthews, who was standing by the communications console. "We need to find out," he said, his voice calm, but with a trace of concern. "Prepare for an encounter." Minutes passed in uneasy silence, and the crew could feel the ship being pulled in multiple directions. The tension grew as the seconds ticked by. What they had once thought to be a routine mission was quickly turning into something far more dangerous. Then another signal came through the ship's damaged communication system. It was not a voice they recognized nor a message they understood. Instead, it was a chilling message broadcasted in a language no human had ever heard before. It echoed through the ship's speakers, a low growl, almost like a warning. "We are the Zalith. You are weak. Prepare for your extinction." The crew froze. The word sent a shiver down their spines. Zalith. The very name had been whispered in old stories, forgotten warnings from the distant past. No one believed in them anymore. But now their worst nightmare was becoming a reality. Captain Matthews ordered the ship to change course, hoping to avoid whatever the Zalith had planned. But the Tempest was too slow. The ship was caught in their grasp, unable to escape. In the distance, the first ship of the Zalith fleet appeared. It was like nothing the crew had ever seen before. The ship was massive, its sleek surface reflecting the stars around it, almost like a shadow in the sky. The Zalith were here, and they were not here for peace. "Prepare for impact," Commander Matthews shouted, realizing there was no way out. The Zalith fleet was unlike any other. They didn't rely on traditional weapons. Instead, their technology was incomprehensible, a fusion of energy and matter that allowed them to manipulate space itself. They had the power to bend the laws of physics, creating weapons that could disintegrate entire ships in an instant. The crew of the Tempest watched in horror as the Zalith ships began to position themselves around their vessel. The stars seemed to dim as a cold shadow overtook the sky. The ship was surrounded by an impenetrable field. There was no escape. There was no help. Suddenly, a large beam of light shot out from the Zalith ship. It wasn't a laser. It wasn't a missile. It was something far more dangerous. The energy beam hit the Tempest with a force that sent the ship spiraling out of control. Sparks flew from the control panels, and the ship's lights flickered as the crew scrambled to stabilize the vessel. "Brace for impact," Captain Matthews shouted, his voice strained, but it was too late. The Zalith were far too powerful. The beam tore through the ship's hull, sending shockwaves throughout the vessel. The crew was thrown from their seats and alarms blared throughout the ship. When the dust finally settled, the Tempest was still intact, but it was badly damaged. The crew had survived, but for how long? The Zalith had only just begun their assault. "Stay calm," Captain Matthews said, his voice shaking but firm. "We're not dead yet." But the crew knew the truth. They were facing an enemy like no other. The Zalith had come to conquer, to destroy humanity, and they were just getting started. As the ship drifted through the dark, broken, and powerless, a single thought passed through their minds. Humanity was about to face its greatest test. Would they survive? Or would the Zalith finally end what they had started so long ago? The battle for survival had begun. The silence of space was shattered, replaced by the hum of the Tempest's damaged systems. Captain Matthews stood in the command center, his eyes fixed on the view of the Zalith fleet in the distance. The ship had been crippled, and their chances of survival were shrinking by the second. But what terrified Matthews the most wasn't the looming destruction. It was the realization that they were facing an enemy unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. "We can't keep hiding forever," Lieutenant Phillips said, her voice filled with both fear and determination. "We need to fight back. We need to warn Earth." Matthews turned toward her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "We can't fight them. Not like this. We have no weapons, no way of communicating. We're sitting ducks. But we can't just give up," Phillips insisted. "We need to find a way to warn Earth. They're coming for us. The whole galaxy's in danger." Matthews didn't respond. He knew she was right, but the weight of the situation was crushing. They were alone, stranded in a distant part of the galaxy with no hope of reinforcements. And worst of all, no one knew they were here. Across the crew's remaining channels, panic was beginning to set in. The Tempest's engineers scrambled to make repairs, but the damage was too extensive. Their communications array was down, the engines were barely functional, and the ship's shields were nearly depleted. If the Zalith decided to finish what they had started, they would be powerless to stop them. Hours passed in tense silence, until the unexpected happened. A single signal crackled through the static on their comm system. A human voice, faint but unmistakable, emerged from the noise. "Is anyone out there? This is Lieutenant Aiden, Earth Resistance. Please respond." Captain Matthews's heart skipped a beat. It was a distress signal, but it wasn't from Earth. The voice was too distant, too broken, yet there was no mistaking it. A human was out there, and they were desperate. "Phillips, can you trace that signal?" Matthews asked, his voice hoarse with hope. Lieutenant Phillips worked quickly, rerouting their failing communication system, but the signal was faint and full of interference. After several agonizing moments, she looked up, her face pale. "I've got a fix," she said. "It's coming from the outer rim. It's an old military transmission. They're still out there." Matthews felt a surge of hope, another human still alive, still fighting. But his relief was short-lived as the full gravity of the situation hit him again. If the Zalith found them, it would mean the end. "We need to find them," Matthews decided. "They might have information, resources, anything that can help us." But before they could take any action, a new signal flooded their comm system. This one wasn't human. It was the Zalith. A distorted voice, cold and emotionless, reverberated through the speakers. "You cannot escape. Humanity is nothing but a fleeting moment in the history of the galaxy. Prepare for your extinction." The message repeated itself, louder and more demanding, until the crew could do nothing but listen. The Zalith were not here for negotiations. They had come to wipe out humanity, and the universe would be theirs. "Captain, what do we do?" Phillips asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthews stared at the holographic display of the Zalith fleet, their ships hovering just outside the Tempest's range. The truth was clear, they were outmatched. The Zalith weren't simply invaders. They were conquerors. And if humanity didn't act quickly, Earth would fall. The thought was unbearable. "We fight," Matthews said, the words coming with a force he didn't feel. "We have to." As the crew scrambled to make sense of their dwindling resources, Matthews couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. They had no weapons to fight back, no defense against the powerful technology of the Zalith. The Zalith ships were capable of erasing them from existence with a single strike. Yet Matthews knew they couldn't surrender. They couldn't let Earth fall without a fight. The signal from Lieutenant Aiden continued to fade in and out, offering the only flicker of hope. Whoever this person was, they had to be their salvation. Matthews made a decision. "Prepare to head toward the signal's origin," Matthews ordered, his voice growing steady. "We'll search for any remaining resistance. We may be humanity's last hope." As the Tempest limped toward the edge of known space, every crew member knew this was their only chance. Aiden's signal was faint, but it was a chance. They had no choice but to take it. But the closer they came to the signal's source, the more the crew felt the weight of their situation. They were venturing into uncharted space, a place where the Zalith had already made their presence known. It was a gamble, and Matthews wasn't sure if they would make it back alive. Hours turned into days as they slowly approached the edge of the galaxy. Tensions were high as every crew member knew the stakes. They were not just fighting for survival, They were fighting for humanity's future. But deep down, Matthews couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. Then the worst happened. A sharp, bone-rattling alarm went off, and the ship lurched violently. The Zalith had found them. They were caught in a deadly embrace. Matthews could see the massive Zalith ship closing in on them, and the Tempest was helpless, drifting into the enemy's grasp. "Brace for impact," Matthews shouted as the Tempest was surrounded by the dark shadows of the enemy fleet. The galaxy's darkest hour had arrived. The Tempest trembled as the crew prepared for what seemed like their inevitable end. The Zalith fleet had them surrounded, and the cold void of space outside was filled with the menacing shadow of their enemy. Captain Matthews stood at the helm, his knuckles white from gripping the controls. They were caught in the grasp of a far superior force, and there was nowhere to run. "Captain, they're locking onto us," Lieutenant Phillips said, her voice strained. Her hands flew over the controls, desperately trying to make any adjustments that could buy them more time. "Shields are still down and we're completely exposed." Matthews didn't respond immediately. His eyes were locked on the massive Zalith ship that loomed above them, a dark, ominous shape that seemed to swallow the stars around it. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The crew, his crew, was counting on him to lead them out of this, but how could they escape? The Zalith were far too powerful, and their technology was unlike anything humanity had ever faced. "We don't escape, Lieutenant," Matthews said, his voice steady but grim. "We fight." Phillips looked up in surprise. "Fight with what?" "We have nothing. No weapons. No shields. We're sitting targets." "We don't need weapons," Matthews replied. "We need to outthink them. We've got something the Zalith don't have, the human spirit. We've survived against impossible odds before. It's time we did it again." A murmur of disbelief passed through the crew. Could they really win with nothing but their wits and their will to survive? Matthews knew it sounded impossible, but he had no other choice but to believe it. The Zalith might have overwhelming firepower, but they had underestimated humanity's greatest asset, their ability to adapt, to fight back when all seemed lost. The ship shuddered again as a warning alarm sounded. The Zalith had fired, and the Tempest rocked from the impact. Phillips was thrown from her seat, and the lights flickered, plunging them into darkness for a split second before emergency power kicked in. They were already taking damage, and their options were running out. "Captain, we can't survive another hit like that," Phillips said, struggling to get back to her console. Matthews looked over at the crew, their faces pale but determined. He knew they couldn't keep running. The Zalith would not let them escape. If they wanted to survive, they had to make a stand. They had to do something the Zalith wouldn't expect. "Activate the emergency escape pods," Matthews ordered, though his tone was resolute. "Prepare them for launch." The crew moved quickly, ready to do whatever it took to survive. But Matthews's plan was more than just a retreat. It was a distraction, a feint to draw the Zalith into a trap. They would use the pods to lure the enemy into thinking they were fleeing, only to have them hit with an unexpected attack. Lieutenant Phillips worked furiously at her console, sending out a series of decoy signals designed to confuse the Zalith. As expected, the enemy ships moved into position, aligning themselves to intercept the pods. But Matthews had one final trick up his sleeve. "Now," he shouted. At that signal, the Tempest released its emergency pods, but they weren't just decoys. Each one carried a special explosive device, something the crew had rigged in secret using whatever materials they could find. The pods would scatter and explode at the Zalith ship's most vulnerable points. It wasn't much, but it was something that could give them a chance. The decoy pods flew toward the Zalith ships, and the enemy quickly locked onto them, believing they were humanity's last attempt to escape. Then, as the Zalith prepared to fire, the first explosion went off. A massive burst of energy tore through space, shaking the nearest Zalith ship. The explosion was followed by several more, each one sending ripples through the enemy fleet. "Hit them again," Matthews ordered, his voice sharp. "Full power to all remaining decoys." The Tempest unleashed every last bit of their resources into the decoys, each explosion chipping away at the Zalith's superior technology. The battle was far from won, but the tide was starting to turn. For the first time, the Zalith ships were on the defensive. Their massive fleet had been rattled, and Matthews could see the moment of hesitation in their movements. "We've got them on the run," Phillips shouted, her eyes wide with excitement. "They're confused, Captain." "We can do this." But Matthews wasn't ready to get his hopes up. This was just the beginning, and they were still far from victory. The Zalith might have been stunned, but they would recover. They were far too powerful to fall easily. They'll regroup, Matthews said grimly. We can't fight them head-on. Our only chance is to keep them off balance. But just as he spoke, a new alarm blared. It was a message from Earth. A faint transmission, weak and distorted, but it was clear. We've received your distress signal. Reinforcements are on the way. Hold out as long as you can. Matthews felt a surge of relief flood through him. Earth had heard their cry for help. Help was coming, but would they be able to survive long enough to see it? Prepare for battle, Matthews said, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. We fight for Earth. We fight for humanity. As the Tempest readied for its final stand, Matthews knew one thing. This would not be the end. Not today. Not while there was breath in their lungs. The Zalith had underestimated humanity's will to survive, and that mistake would cost them everything. The final battle was about to begin. The silence that followed the last explosion was deafening. For a moment it felt like time had stopped, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The Tempest drifted, battered but alive amidst the wreckage of decoy pods and the fractured remains of Zalith ships. Their decoy strategy had worked, at least for now, but the real fight was just beginning. Captain Matthews stood at the helm, staring into the void, his mind racing. They had bought themselves a little time, but the Zalith were regrouping. The true battle was ahead, and they were still outmatched. Captain, the reinforcements are still a day away, Lieutenant Phillips said, her voice tight with tension. We can't hold out that long. Matthews turned to face his crew, his expression unreadable. Then we make this count. We're not waiting to die. He wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. Humanity had always been the underdog, fighting to survive in a galaxy dominated by powerful civilizations. But now, more than ever, Matthews felt that deep, stubborn resolve that had gotten humanity this far. They had always fought against the odds, whether it was a planet under attack or a war with another species. It was that same human spirit, undefeated, unyielding, that had carried them forward. And it would carry them again. Lieutenant, reroute the remaining power to the engines, Matthews ordered, his voice steady. We need to get closer to the Zalith ships. We fight up close. It's the only way we can level the playing field. Phillips hesitated. We're too close to their ships as it is. One shot and we're finished. Do it, Matthews said. We're taking the fight to them. No more running. The crew moved swiftly, pushing the Tempest toward the heart of the Zalith fleet. There was a fire in Matthews's chest, an urgency he hadn't felt before. Humanity had always been seen as weak, as insignificant in the grand scale of the galaxy. But the Zalith were about to learn that there was more to humanity than met the eye. Humanity had something they couldn't anticipate, the will to fight when all seemed lost. As they moved in closer, the Zalith ships began to focus their fire on the Tempest. A barrage of energy blasts lit up the dark void, but Matthews remained calm. They dodged and weaved through the blasts, using the damaged ship's agility to their advantage. The Zalith were relentless, but Matthews could feel it. This was their chance. They weren't just surviving now. They were fighting. Captain, our systems are failing faster than expected, Lieutenant Phillips reported. We won't be able to keep this up much longer. I know, Matthews replied, his voice grim. But if we don't do something now, we won't be around to make the next move. At that moment, something unexpected happened. The Tempest shuddered violently, as if something had awakened deep within the ship. There was a strange energy in the air, something Matthews couldn't quite explain. It was as though the very essence of the ship had stirred, had reacted to the desperation of their situation. For a brief moment, Matthews thought he saw something, a flash of light, an electrical pulse, but it was gone before he could focus on it. Did anyone else feel that? Matthews asked, his voice uneasy. Negative, Phillips responded, shaking her head. Are you sure it wasn't just a system glitch? I don't know, Matthews said, his brow furrowing. He stared at the control panel, as if looking for something that would explain the strange phenomenon. But whatever it was, I think it's giving us a chance. As they closed in on the Zalith flagship, the situation grew even more dire. Their ship was barely holding together. The Tempest was a skeleton of its former self, with systems failing one by one. Matthews could see the damage on the screens. The hull was cracked and internal pressure was dangerously low. But he could feel the crew's energy, their collective will to fight, pushing them forward. We're almost there, Matthews said, his voice tight with determination. We hit them now, with everything we have left. With their last remaining resources, the crew initiated a final, all-out assault. They had no missiles, no bombs. All they had were their dwindling power reserves, and they would use it to overload the ship's energy core and send it directly into the Zalith flagship. It was their last shot, a suicide mission, but one that had to be done. "Hold tight," Matthews said, gripping the controls as the ship shuddered again. "We go in fast, we go in hard." As they accelerated toward the Zalith ship, Matthews glanced at the faces of his crew. They were tired, scared, but resolute. They weren't giving up, not while there was breath in their lungs. Just as they neared the flagship, the energy core of the Tempest began to pulse, reacting to something deep within the ship's systems. Matthews didn't understand what was happening, but he knew they had a brief moment to strike. The ship's final charge was upon them. "We're going in," Matthews ordered. Full power to the core. The ship surged forward, its engines firing on all cylinders. The Zalith flagship loomed large before them, its dark, imposing figure ready to deliver the final blow. But the Tempest wasn't giving up. It wasn't just the ship anymore. It was everything humanity had ever stood for. Every person who had fought for freedom, for survival, for hope. Every single life had brought them to this moment. Then, as if the universe itself had conspired in their favor, the strange energy Matthews had felt earlier flared to life. It was as though the very essence of the ship had unlocked a hidden power, an ancient human force that had been dormant within their very DNA. The ship was no longer just a machine. It had become a symbol of humanity's resilience. With this new surge of power, they smashed into the Zalith flagship, sending shockwaves through the dark void of space. The explosion was blinding. The blinding explosion echoed through the cold vacuum of space, shaking the very fabric of the universe. For a moment, everything was consumed by the light. The Tempest, the Zalith flagship, and the very stars themselves seemed to vanish in the aftermath. But when the light dimmed and the dust settled, something unexpected happened. The Tempest had survived. Captain Matthews opened his eyes slowly. His head ached and the ship's control panels flickered weakly in front of him. He could hear the faint hum of systems coming back online, the sounds of life amidst the chaos. But the damage was clear. The Tempest was barely holding together, yet despite everything, they were alive. "Report," Matthews ordered, his voice rough. Lieutenant Phillips was the first to speak, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Captain, we've done it. The Zalith flagship, it's gone. Completely gone." Matthews blinked, trying to make sense of her words. "Gone?" "Gone," Phillips repeated, her eyes wide. "We hit them with everything we had. They never saw it coming. Their fleet is in disarray. Some of their ships are retreating." A wave of disbelief washed over Matthews. It was impossible. The Zalith had been so much more powerful than anything humanity had ever faced. Their technology, their tactics, they were unbeatable. Or so they thought. But somehow, against all odds, humanity had prevailed. They had struck the final blow. But as Matthews took in the situation, his joy was short-lived. The Tempest had suffered catastrophic damage. The engines were offline, and the hull was breached in several places. They were stranded in the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by the wreckage of the Zalith fleet. Even with their victory, they were far from safe. "We need to get out of here," Matthews said, his voice firm. "Now. We've bought Earth some time, but we're not done yet." Phillips nodded, still processing the gravity of what had just happened. "We can't jump to hyperspace. The engines are fried." A deep, resonating silence filled the room. They were trapped with no way to contact Earth and no way to escape. But Matthews wasn't ready to give up. They had faced the impossible and survived. They would face whatever came next the same way. "Then we wait," Matthews said quietly. "We wait for the reinforcements. They're coming. We just need to hold out long enough." But deep down, Matthews knew the Zalith wouldn't stop. Their defeat was just a setback, and they would be back, stronger than ever. The fight wasn't over. Humanity had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. As the hours passed, the Tempest drifted through the wreckage of the Zalith fleet. The crew moved slowly, working to make repairs wherever they could. Despite their exhaustion, there was a sense of quiet triumph in the air. They had won. Against all odds, humanity had proven that it wasn't ready to be wiped out just yet. Lieutenant Phillips was the first to break the silence. "Captain, there's something you need to see." Matthews followed her to the control room where she was examining a holographic map of the galaxy. She pointed to a cluster of Zalith ships that had been in the process of retreating. But there was something unusual. A ship different from the others was approaching. It was unlike any vessel Matthews had seen before. Its shape was sleek and angular, and it was moving toward them at a faster pace than the Zalith ships had ever demonstrated. "What is that?" Matthews asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't know," Phillips replied, "but it's not one of theirs. It's human." A sudden surge of hope rushed through Matthews. Could it be? Had Earth finally sent reinforcements? His heart raced as the unknown ship grew closer, its shape becoming clearer. The ship came into view and Matthews' breath caught in his throat. It was unlike any human ship he had ever seen. It was sleek, black, and almost elegant. There was an air of advanced technology surrounding it, something beyond what the Tempest had ever been capable of. This was not a standard Earth ship. This was something else entirely, something new, something that had been hidden from them. The ship hailed them. The message that came through was calm, almost soothing. "This is the Archangel, flagship of the Earth Resistance Fleet. We received your distress signal." "You've done well, Captain Matthews." Matthews's jaw dropped. The Earth Resistance Fleet? He had heard rumors, whispers really, of a clandestine force working behind the scenes far beyond the reach of Earth's governments. But he never thought they were real. And now they were here. How are you here?" Matthews asked, his voice hoarse. "We've been monitoring the situation for some time, Captain," the voice on the other end replied. "Humanity's potential is vast, and we've just begun to tap into it. You've shown the galaxy what humanity is capable of. We are here to finish this." Relief flooded Matthews's chest, but as he looked out the viewports at the approaching ship, something else stirred within him. The battle was over, yes, but the war, that was just beginning, and humanity had shown that no matter how far the enemy pushed, they would never break. The fire that burned within humanity would continue to fuel them. They had risen from nothing, from the brink of extinction, and they had proven that humanity would never fall. The Archangel docked with the Tempest, and Matthews stood at the airlock, waiting. As the doors opened, a figure stepped through. The person was tall, clad in sleek dark armor that glowed faintly with some unknown energy. The figure's eyes were hidden behind a helmet, but their presence was undeniable. They were human, and they were more than just a soldier. They were the embodiment of humanity's evolution. "This is only the beginning, Captain," the figure said, their voice unmistakably human but filled with authority. "The Zalith were the first of many threats, but now humanity has the means to defend itself." Matthews stood silently, absorbing the weight of the moment. The war had been won, but humanity's future had just begun. As the crew gathered, Matthews looked around at the people who had fought so hard, who had sacrificed everything for the survival of their species. They had defied the odds, and now they were on the verge of something greater than they could have ever imagined. Humanity had found its place in the stars, and it was only just beginning to shine.